The dust of the old frontier had a way of settling on everything, even the lives of men who swore they'd never be tied to anyone or anything. In a small American village tucked along a wagon road, where the clap of horseshoes against hard earth echoed louder than church bells, one man's choices began to stir whispers that would ripple far beyond the wooden fences and narrow lanes. Travelers paused at the general store. Old women glanced out from curtained windows, and the children, barefoot and wide-eyed, watched him with a mix of curiosity and fear. For he had done something no man in town had dared before. He bought the most beautiful Apache slave woman, and by the next day, she was no longer his property. She was his wife. The news traveled faster than smoke through a dry field. In a town where gossip was traded like coin, tongues wagged and heads shook. Folks wondered what drove him to such a decision, and others wondered what hidden force lay in the woman herself that could have changed a man so suddenly. But few knew the truth, and fewer still had the courage to ask. The story began not with that bold marriage, but with the day he walked into the market, when the air smelled of sweat, leather, and cattle feed. And locked eyes with the woman, no, one could forget. She stood quiet in the shadow of a post, her wrists bound by rough rope, her hair falling wild like a black river over her shoulders. The villagers did not see her as a woman. They saw her as something foreign, something dangerous, something broken. Yet she carried herself with a strange kind of fire, her gaze unbending, her back straight, as though she refused to bow even in chains. Most men averted their eyes, but he did not. His stare lingered long enough to stir the unease of the trader who kept her close, long enough to draw the attention of men nearby who smirked and muttered under their breath. He said nothing then, but something in him shifted. The man had lived his life with a kind of stubborn silence. He built fences, mended roofs, drove cattle, and kept to himself. He was no stranger to hard work or hard drink, and though women had passed in and out of his path, he had never let one in close enough to soften his edges. But that morning, as the sun baked the dust into gold, he felt a weight in his chest he couldn't explain. She looked at him, not pleading, not broken, but with an unspoken challenge, as if daring him to see her as more than what the ropes declared. The bidding began with the usual shouts, men laughing as though it were a game. Some made offers out of pride, others out of cruelty. He waited, leaning against the wooden beam, his face unreadable. The trader barked the woman's age, her strength, her obedience, though none of it was true. She had not been broken, and anyone with sense could see it. When the moment came, when the last man hesitated, he stepped forward. His voice, low but steady, cut through the noise. He would take her. No bargaining, no showmanship. He paid in full and walked away, the woman trailing behind, her steps sure, her face unreadable, though her eyes flickered with something distrust, perhaps, or something sharper. That evening the town buzzed. Men joked at the saloon, some jealous, some mocking. Women frowned in disapproval, whispering that such a union was unnatural, even dangerous. The preacher shook his head, muttering about sins and trials, yet none of them saw the way she carried her silence into the man's house, or how he treated her with a kind of careful distance, as though he knew the weight of what he had done. Night stretched long, the crickets singing in the dark, the wooden boards creaking under restless feet. He sat by the fire, staring into the flames, while she remained in the corner, watchful, still as stone. Two strangers bound together by rope, coin, and circumstance. Yet something hung between them, unspoken but powerful. He wondered if he had made a mistake, if tomorrow he would regret it. And she wondered if freedom was ever possible, if trust could ever be earned from the hands of a man who had taken her fate into his own. When dawn came, the first light spilling across the hills, the man walked out into the yard with a mind made up. The world had given him choices, and he had chosen a path none would understand. That morning he declared to the town what none expected. The woman was no longer his slave. She was his wife. The word struck like a hammer against iron. The saloon fell silent. The women at the well gasped. The blacksmith muttered under his breath, Some thought he had lost his wits. Others believed the woman had bewitched him. But the truth was more complicated, tangled in history, in pride, in something neither of them had yet spoken aloud. She did not smile, nor did she bow her head. She stood beside him, her eyes steady, her expression unyielding, as if daring the town to challenge her place at his side. From that day forward, the village changed. Suspicion sharpened in the eyes of neighbors. Doors closed when they walked by. Whispers followed them like shadows. He bore it with silence, and she bore it with fire. But underneath the unease, something else stirred curiosity, wonder, fear, for no one knew what had passed between them that first night. What promise or defiance had bound them, tighter than rope ever could. Yet not all threats came from wagging tongues or suspicious glances. Beyond the edges of the village, in the wild hills where the river cut through stone, there were others who had not forgotten her. The Apache did not forgive easily, nor did they abandon their own. Rumors spread that riders had been seen near the ridge, that smoke signals carried warnings that vengeance might yet come to the man who dared claim her. And though the town buzzed with gossip, he and the woman shared their silence, waiting for what neither could name. The days turned restless. Every knock at the door, every hoofbeat in the distance, carried a tension that could not be shaken. He watched the horizon with wary eyes, and she studied him with a guarded heart. Was he her captor or her protector? Was she his wife or his undoing? The answer hung just out of reach, like a storm building on the far plains. And then, one evening, as the sun sank and painted the sky in blood and gold, a shadow appeared at the edge of their land. A lone figure, silent, unmoving, watching. The man stepped forward, his hand instinctively brushing the rifle by the door. The woman's breath caught, her eyes narrowing as recognition sparked in them. Whoever it was, they had not come by accident. The old village hushed that night, sensing the shift in the air. Something was coming, something that would test the bond neither of them fully understood. And as the crickets stilled and the fire burned low, the woman's voice, quiet, steady, and fierce, broke the silence for the first time. What she said would change everything. Her voice was low, almost swallowed by the crackle of the fire, yet it cut through the silence with the weight of a stone thrown into still water. "He is not here for you," she said, her eyes locked on the dark figure at the edge of the field. The man froze, his grip tightening around the rifle, though he had not lifted it. She had not spoken a single word until now, and hearing her voice unsettled him more than the shadow waiting in the dusk. It was not just the word Zaidi, was the certainty in them. The way she spoke, as though she knew the stranger, as though she had been waiting for this moment. He dared not ask her what she meant. The stranger remained still, a dark outline against the dying light, before turning and vanishing into the tree line without a sound. For a long time neither of them moved, the air heavy with the threat of something unseen. When at last she turned her gaze to him, he saw no fear there. Instead, there was something else, something harder. Something that warned him her life before this place was written in scars he could not see. That night stretched on with restless weight. The man found himself pacing the wooden floorboards, listening for every shift of the wind, every snap of a branch outside. The woman sat in silence, her face unreadable, though her eyes followed him with a watchfulness that unsettled him. He had bought her in a moment that seemed simple, but nothing about her was simple. She carried stories he had not asked for, stories that now pressed against the walls of his house like ghosts. The next morning, the village whispered louder than before. Someone had seen the shadow on the ridge. Others claimed they had heard a whistle in the night, carried on the wind. Fear spread quicker than truth, and the man found himself the center of a storm he had not asked for. At the saloon, men muttered into their mugs, shaking their heads. At the church steps, women warned each other to keep their children close. To them, the Apache woman was a curse brought into their midst, a fire that would burn them all if not snuffed out. Yet, when he looked at her, he did not see a curse. He saw a woman who carried herself like a queen, even in rags, whose silence was heavier than most men's boasts, whose eyes revealed pieces of a world he had never understood. Still he could not deny the truth. Trouble was coming, and it was tied to her. As the days passed, he began to notice things. She walked the land as though she had known it long before his house stood there. Pausing at certain trees, studying the bends in the river, listening to the cries of distant birds with a strange focus. At night, when she thought him asleep, she murmured words in her own tongue, soft and steady, like prayers carried to a sky that was not his. Once, he heard her laugh quietly to herself, a sound sharp and bitter, as if mocking the chains that had once bound her wrists. She was not broken, not even close. And the more he watched her, the more he wondered if she had allowed herself to be taken only to survive, carrying some secret plan he could not yet name. One evening, unable to carry his questions any longer, he asked her directly. "Who was that man?" he said, his voice gruff but careful. She looked at him for a long while, the fire casting shadows over her face. At last she replied, "Not a man you want to meet." She said nothing more, and he did not press her, though her words followed him like a shadow. The tension between them deepened, not with anger, but with silence. Each day he rose before the sun, working the land with calloused hands, while she moved through the house and yard with quiet purpose. Sometimes he caught her watching him with a look he could not read. Other times she seemed distant, her mind far away in places he would never see. He wanted to ask her about her people, about the life she had lived before chains. But every time the words reached his lips, something held him back. He knew enough to understand that asking might open wounds not yet ready to bleed. The villagers grew more restless. One night, as he passed the saloon, he heard his name spoken through the slats of the wall. "He's lost his senses," one man said, "bringing danger to us all." Another spat and muttered, "That woman's kin won't let this stand. They'll come for her, and when they do, they'll come for all of us." The man kept walking, his jaw tight, the words biting deeper than he cared to admit. He knew they were not wrong. The woman, too, sensed the shifting air. She began to move with more care, glancing at the ridges when the wind carried distant echoes. One afternoon she found a feather lodged in the fence post, tied with a strip of rawhide. She plucked it free, her hands trembling only for a heartbeat. Before she hid it inside her dress, that night she burned it in the fire, the smoke curling like a message she refused to translate. Still, she said nothing of what she knew. Yet in her silence was a story, and the man felt it pressing closer. Each day, he began to see her not as someone he had taken, but as someone who might slip through his hands at any moment, like water spilling from a cracked jug. The thought unsettled him more than the threat of enemies in the hills. I'd never wanted to belong to anyone, never wanted to need anyone, yet here he was, standing watch at night, not for his own sake, but for hers. As summer deepened, the nights grew hotter, and the horizon burned with storms that never reached the village. Each thunderclap in the distance seemed to echo the coming of something neither of them could stop. The man wondered if the day would come when he would stand against the Apache themselves, not as a settler defending his land, but as a husband defending a woman whose heart he had yet to claim. The woman, meanwhile, wrestled with her own storms. She had been torn from her people, sold and traded as though she were nothing. Yet standing beside this man, she found herself in a strange place between freedom and captivity. He did not touch her, did not demand her submission. He treated her with a cautious respect that confused her more than cruelty ever had. She could not decide if he was her enemy or the unlikely ally fate had bound her to. And deep inside, where she dared not admit even to herself, there was a flicker of something dangerous: trust. But trust was not safety. The figure she had seen that night would return, and when he did, he would not come alone. She knew the signs. She had lived them before. She kept her silence not because she did not care, but because she feared the truth would unravel what little ground she had found. To speak his name, to speak of the bond she had left behind, would be to invite the storm down upon them before they were ready. The days passed heavy with waiting. The man repaired fences and sharpened tools, his eyes always straying to the ridges. The woman watched the shadows, her heart caught between two worlds. And the village held its breath, caught between fear of what might come and curiosity of how it would unfold. Then, one evening, the cry of a lone wolf echoed across the valley. The woman's face paled, her lips parting as if she had heard not an animal, but a message meant only for her. She turned to him, her eyes burning with something fierce, and whispered words that chilled him more than the cry itself. "They have found us." The moment she spoke those words, the air inside the house seemed to shift. The fire burned low, and the shadows along the walls stretched long, as if the night itself leaned closer to listen. The man felt his chest tighten, the weight of her warning pressing down heavier than any burden he had carried before. He had always thought of danger in simple terms: wolves in the fields, outlaws on the road, storms that flatten crops. But this was different. This was something he could not predict, something that carried the memory of blood and vengeance. He looked at her, standing in the glow of the fire, her dark eyes fixed on the window, as though she could already see them. "Coming, how many?" he asked, his voice low. She shook her head. Enough. It was not the answer he wanted, but it was the only one she would give. He wanted to press her, to demand she explain everything she knew, but the way her jaw set told him it would do no good. That night he did not sleep. He sat by the door with the rifle across his knees, listening to the wind move through the trees. The woman stayed awake as well, silent but alert, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze never far from the window. They were strangers bound together by a choice neither of them could undo, and now, the storm gathering in the hills threatened to test what little trust had grown between them. By morning, the village had begun to notice the signs. Tracks on the ridges, fires spotted at night, whispers carried by the few traders who passed through. Fear spread like wildfire. At the saloon, men spoke of forming a guard, though none of them had the stomach to ride out and meet what waited in the hills. At the church, the preacher warned of trials sent from heaven, though in his eyes there was more fear than faith. Children were kept inside and shutters closed earlier each evening. Yet still, all eyes turned to the man and the woman at the center of it all. The blacksmith was the first to speak openly, his hammer striking the anvil with sharp fury as he declared, "It's her they want, and it's us who will pay the price." His words carried, and soon others repeated them. Some whispered that the man should send her away, that the Apache would take back their own and leave the town in peace. Less firm admitted curiosity. They wanted to know why she had been taken, why her people hunted her, and what hold she had over the man who had made her his wife in a single day. The man heard these whispers, but he answered none. He worked his land, his silence his shield, though inside his mind raced. Each time he saw the woman watching the hills, her expression unreadable. He wondered what battles she had already fought, and what scars she hid beneath her calm. One afternoon, while repairing the fence, he found her standing at the edge of the field, her hands gripping the wooden post so tightly her knuckles whitened. He walked toward her, but before he could speak, she whispered, "They will not stop. They will not forgive." Her voice carried a sadness that reached deeper than fear. Wanted to ask her what she had done, what had been done to her, but before the words could leave his mouth, she turned and walked back to the house. The tension between them grew heavier with each passing day. At night, he wondered if she would leave him given the chance, or if she would fight beside him when the riders came. And she wondered if he would stand by her once he knew the truth, or if he would hand her over to save himself. Neither spoke. These doubts allowed, but they hung between them like smoke that refused to clear. Meanwhile, the village brewed its own troubles. A young boy, the son of a farmer, claimed he had seen a rider on the ridge signaling with a mirror. His story spread fast, and fear twisted into anger. A small group of men went to the man's door that evening, their faces hard, their voices sharp. They told him the woman brought danger, that if he cared for the town, he would give her back to her people. He stood in the doorway, rifle in hand, his silence his answer. After a tense moment, they left, muttering curses into the night. The woman had watched from inside, her eyes following each man as he walked away. When the door closed, she looked at him and said quietly, "They fear what they don't know." He studied her for a long moment, then replied, "So do I." Her expression softened, just enough to reveal the truth she feared it too. Subplots began to weave through the tension. The blacksmith's daughter, curious and bold, approached the woman one morning while the man was away. She asked her name, asked her story. The woman did not answer, but she offered the girl a small carved figure she had kept hidden in her dress. The girl carried it home, and whispers spread that the Apache woman carried charms, tokens of power. Some called them curses, others called them blessings, and the mystery only deepened. At the same time, a drifter arrived in town, a man with scars across his face and eyes that missed nothing. He lingered at the saloon, asking questions about the woman, about her people, about the man who had bought her. His presence unsettled the townsfolk, but no one dared confront him. The woman saw him once from across the street, and though her face did not change, her hands tightened into fists at her sides. The man noticed, and though she said nothing, he knew the drifter was no accident. Each night the horizon seemed closer, the fires in the hills brighter. The wolf's cry came more often, sometimes joined by another, then another, until the nights echoed with their chorus. The woman began leaving small offerings near the edge of the fieldstones stacked carefully, feathers tied with strands. Of her hair, when the man asked her why, she said only, "To remind them I still breathe." He did not understand, but he did not stop her. He had learned that her silence was not emptiness, but a shield, and pressing her too hard would only drive her further away. Yet he could not shake the feeling that the closer the riders came, the more she was preparing for something he was not ready to face. The conflict pressed in from every side, neighbors turning cold, strangers appearing with questions, the Apache drawing nearer each night. The man found himself torn between the life he had built and the woman he could not let go. She, in turn, wrestled with a past that refused to die and a present she could not yet trust. Then, one evening, as the sun sank behind the hills and the air grew heavy with the promise of rain, a knock came at their door. It was not the angry fists of fearful neighbors, nor the quiet step of a curious child. It was slow, deliberate, and heavy, each knock echoing like a drum. The man rose, rifle in hand, while the woman's face paled, her lips parting in silent recognition. "Who is it?" he asked, though deep down he already knew the answer. The woman's voice trembled, the first hint of fear he had seen in her. "It begins." The sound of that knock seemed to linger long after it had stopped, as if the wood of the door still trembled with the weight of it. The man stood motionless, his rifle steady in his hands, his breath caught halfway in his chest. The woman had gone pale, her dark eyes fixed on the door as though she could see through it, as though she already knew who waited on the other side. Outside, the air was too quiet, the crickets silent, the night holding its breath. When the man finally moved, it was slow, each step deliberate across the wooden floor. He raised his voice, sharp but steady. "Who's there?" No answer came, only the creak of the porch boards under a shifting weight. His finger tightened on the trigger. The woman's hand reached out to his arm as if to stop him, but she didn't speak. The silence stretched thin, threatening to snap. Then, just as sudden as the knock had come, the sound of boots faded into the night. Whoever it was had left without a word, leaving behind only unease thick enough to choke on. The man didn't open the door, stayed by it, until the first gray light of dawn crept through the cracks of the shutters. Only then did he step outside, the woman following a few paces behind. The porch was empty, but something waited for them. Lying against the doorframe was a single arrow, its shaft painted with markings the man could not read. The woman could. She knelt beside it, her fingers brushing the painted lines, her lips parting just enough to whisper, "They are close." That day, the village erupted. News of the arrow spread before the man had even returned from the porch. Some claimed it was a warning. Others said it was a promise. Men argued in the saloon, fists pounding on the bar, voices rising until threats replaced words. Women gathered in clusters at the well, clutching their children, muttering about curses and blood debts. The preacher spoke louder than he ever had, calling it judgment, a punishment brought upon them by the man's reckless choice. It all, the man and the woman walked the narrow streets in silence, eyes following them like shadows that could not be shaken. The drifter, with the scar across his face, lingered longer in the saloon that day. His eyes sharper, his questions more direct. He asked the blacksmith what the markings on the arrow meant, though the blacksmith claimed ignorance. He asked the farmer's son where exactly the rider had been seen on the ridge, pressing until the boy stammered and turned away. But when the drifter's eyes settled on the woman, watching her from across the street, there was a recognition there, something dark and certain. She saw it too. Her hands trembled just enough for the man to notice, though she quickly hid them in the folds of her dress. That night the storm clouds rolled in, heavy and low, lightning flashing far off on the plains. The man sat by the fire again, the rifle leaning close, his eyes drawn to the door as though expecting it to shake with another knock. The woman sat opposite him, her face lit by the flames. And for the first time since she had spoken that night of the wolf's cry, she told him part of her story. She spoke of her people, of nights under the stars, of a brother who once walked beside her. Her voice softened when she spoke of him, though her jaw tightened when she admitted he had sworn to avenge her. "He believes I betrayed them," she said, her eyes locked on the flames. "He believes I chose chains over blood." She did not weep, did not tremble, but the weight in her voice told him everything he needed to know. The shadow they had seen was no stranger. It was blood. The man felt his stomach twist. He wanted to tell her she had no choice, that survival was not betrayal, but the words stuck. He realized then why she had been so silent, why her eyes carried both fire and sorrow. She was not just running from enemies, she was running from her own kin. And now they had found her. The following days carried an unnatural stillness. Riders did not come yet, but their presence was felt everywhere. Arrows left in fence posts, feathers tied to branches near the stream, smoke rising on the ridges. Each sign was a message, and though the man could not read them, the woman could. Each time she saw one, her face hardened, her silence deepened, and the distance between them grew even as they stood side by side. The village grew more restless. The group of men who had once come to the man's door gathered again. This time in the saloon, their anger louder, their fear sharper. They spoke openly of driving the woman out, of saving themselves before the Apache descended upon them all. The drifter sat among them, quiet, his scarred face unreadable. But when he finally spoke, his voice carried more weight than the rest. "You don't know what she is to them," he said. "You don't know what she's worth." The room fell, silent. No one asked him how he knew, but the seed of his words took root. That night, the man and the woman heard hoofbeats near the field. He rushed outside with his rifle, but the riders stayed just out of sight, their laughter echoing in the dark, taunting. He fired a shot into the air, the sound cracking like thunder, but the laughter only grew louder before fading into the trees. When he returned inside, his hands shook with rage he could not hide. The woman stood waiting, her eyes calm but her shoulders heavy. "They want you to fear," she said softly. "They want you to break before they strike." He looked at her, at the quiet strength in her voice, and he realized the truth. She was not afraid of them. She was afraid of what he might do when they finally came. As days bled into nights, the tension wove tighter around the town. The villagers no longer whispered, they shouted. Lines were being drawn, sides being chosen. Some wanted her gone, others watched with a kind of dark fascination, waiting to see what fate would fall upon them all. The man found himself torn between protecting her and protecting the life he had built in that place, knowing he might lose both. The woman, for her part, moved like someone preparing for an ending she had always known would come. She spent long hours outside, standing by the trees, her face tilted to the wind as if listening for voices carried on it. She murmured prayers he could not understand, stacked stones in patterns he dared not disturb, tied feathers to the porch as though marking it against unseen spirits. Each act unsettled him, yet he could not deny that her presence gave the place a strength it had not known before. Then came the night when the drifter knocked at their door. It was not heavy like the knock before, not threatening, but deliberate. The man answered with his rifle at hand, his jaw tight. The drifter stood there, hat low, rain dripping from his coat. He looked past the man to the woman, his scar pulling as he spoke. "They'll come soon," he said. "And when they do, you'll have to decide if she's worth dying for." The man said nothing, but his silence was answer enough. The drifter smirked, then tipped his hat to the woman. "Your brother sends his greetings." Her breath caught, her hand gripping the doorframe as though to keep from falling. The drifter walked away without another word, leaving them in silence broken only by the patter of rain. Inside, the woman's face was pale, her eyes distant. She whispered one word, so soft he almost missed it. Soon, the days that followed blurred into a waiting game, each hour stretching like a rope drawn tighter and tighter. The riders drew nearer, fires burned closer to the village. Signals flickered on the ridges, and the cries of wolves echoed almost every night. The villagers fortified their homes, sharpened their tools, whispered of leaving altogether. But no one left. They were trapped, not by walls, but by fear of what would come if they turned their backs. And through it all, the man and the woman stood together, bound by choice, by silence, by the storm that pressed down upon them. He wondered if he had the strength to face what was coming, and she wondered if he would stand when the truth of her past finally reached its bloody edge. Then, one evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, the riders appeared. Dozens of them, dark shapes cresting the ridge, their horses moving like shadows against the fire-streaked sky. The village froze, the air thick with terror. Children were pulled inside, doors slammed shut. The church bell rang, though no service had been called. The man stood on his porch, rifle in hand, the woman beside him, her eyes fixed on the figures approaching. Her brother rode at the front. Even at a distance, she knew his shape, the way he carried himself, the fire in his movements. He had not come for talk. He'd come for blood. The man felt his pulse thunder in his ears, his breath sharp and shallow. The woman's hand brushed his arm, steady and unyielding. "It begins now," she whispered. The riders reached the edge of the field and stopped. The silence was crushing, the distance between them alive with unspoken threats. Lightning cracked. Far off, thunder rolling across the plains. The man raised his rifle, his finger hovering at the trigger. The woman stepped forward, her voice rising strong and steady into the heavy air, and then the world seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the first strike that would shatter everything. The silence between the two sides stretched so thin it felt like the world might split open from the weight of it. The man held his rifle steady, the wood firm against his shoulder, yet he knew in his heart that one pull of the trigger would ignite something that could never be undone. Across the field, her brother sat tall on his horse, his eyes locked on the woman standing at the man's side. Lightning flashed, and for a moment the storm lit his face in stark detail and guard, carved deep into every line. Grief hard as stone behind his eyes. The woman stepped forward slowly, away from the safety of the porch. The man's hand twitched, as if to hold her back, but he let her go. She walked across the dirt, the storm wind tugging at her hair, her bare feet steady against the ground she had come to call both prison and refuge. She lifted her chin, her voice carrying clear and strong into the night air. "Brother." Brother did not move, but the tightening of his jaw revealed the storm brewing inside him. "You stand with him?" His words cut sharp, carrying across the space between them. "I stand where life is left for me," she answered. Her voice wavered only once, then steadied. "They took me. I endured. I chose to live." A murmur rippled through the riders. Behind him, some shifted in their saddles, uneasy. Others spat into the dirt, their fury unbroken. Her brother's hand flexed on the reins, his eyes narrowing. "You could have returned. You could have fought to come home." The woman shook her head slowly. "And would you have listened? Would you have seen me as whole again, or would you have seen only chains where wrists once bled?" Her words struck like arrows, and though her brother's face remained hard, the man saw the flicker of conflict beneath it. The riders behind him began to stir louder now, muttering, waiting for the order to strike. The man knew they stood on the edge of ruin, and that one wrong word would unleash fire. He lowered his rifle. It was not surrender, but a choice. He stepped down from the porch and stood beside her, facing the riders with empty hands. I will not fight you unless you force me to, he said. But she is my wife. She is not your prisoner, nor mine. She is free. The riders erupted in shouts, some demanding blood, others arguing in their tongue, the storm above echoing their unrest. The brother raised his hand, silencing them with a single motion. His gaze bore into the man with such intensity it nearly buckled his knees, but he stood firm, his heart pounding in his chest like a drum. For a long time no one moved. Rain began to fall, steady at first, then heavy, the storm breaking open. Above them, thunder shook the sky, and the horses stamped nervously in the mud. The brother's eyes shifted back to his sister, and in them lay years of memory, of loyalty, of betrayal, and of love too heavy to name. Finally he spoke, his voice raw. If you walk this path, you are no longer of us. The woman bowed her head, her hair plastered to her face by the rain. Then let me walk it, she whispered. The brother's jaw clenched, his knuckles white around the reins. Then with a sharp pull, he turned his horse. The riders behind him hesitated, confusion rippling through them, but one by one they followed, their anger swallowed by the command of their leader. The sound of their departure was thunderous, hooves pounding the earth. Fading into the storm until only silence and rain remained, the woman sank to her knees in the mud, her shoulders trembling, though no tears came. The man knelt beside her, placing his hand gently over hers. She looked at him then, her eyes hollow but alive, and for the first time since the day he had taken her from that market. He saw not silence, not a shield, but the truth of who she was. In the days that followed, the village slowly breathed again. The riders did not return. The fires on the ridges faded, and the nights grew quiet. The people of the town remained wary, but the threat that had hung over them like a blade had lifted. The saloon no longer buzzed with talk of curses, the church no longer thundered with warnings of doom. Life in its stubborn way found its rhythm again. Yet things had changed. The drifter with the scar vanished without a word, though whispers claimed he had ridden after the Apache, carrying news no one else dared to deliver. The blacksmith's daughter still clutched the small carving the woman had given her, speaking of it with reverence. And though many eyes in the village still watched the couple with suspicion, a few now looked with something else respect, or at least acknowledgement that they had faced the storm and endured. The man returned to his work, repairing fences, tending fields, his hands steady, though his thoughts often wandered. The woman walked the land in quiet solitude, her prayers softer now, her offerings fewer. She carried herself with the same strength as before, but something in her had shifted. She no longer moved as one caught between two worlds. As someone who had chosen her own. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in red and gold, the man sat on the porch while she worked at the fire. He found himself speaking words he had held back for too long. "I don't know if I deserve you," he said quietly. She looked up, her eyes meeting his. For a long moment she said nothing, then she crossed the porch and sat beside him. "You gave me no chains," she answered softly. "That is enough." They sat together in the fading light, the silence between them no longer heavy, but full, carrying the weight of survival, of choices made, of storms weathered. The horizon stretched wide before them, uncertain, but open. The story of the man and the woman did not end in fire or blood, but in something quieter, something harder to earn. It ended in survival and the fragile peace that comes after the storm has passed. In the steady heartbeat of two people who chose to stand together when the world demanded they break apart, the village would remember them not as a curse, a tale of betrayal, but as a story of endurance. Of a woman who carried scars like armor, and a man who learned that strength is not in holding, but in letting stand beside, and though the past would never fully leave them, the brother's shadow lingering on the horizon. The memory of chains still heavy in her heart, they had found something neither had expected, a life worth keeping. However uncertain, however fragile, as the night fell and the first stars cut through the dark, the man reached for her hand. She did not pull away. She held it firm and steady as the crickets began to sing again, and the wind carried the last trace of storm away into the distance. Their story, bound by fire, shadow, and choice, settled into the quiet truth of what it had always been about. Not victory, not defeat, but the simple act of surviving together.